about to arrive, so I thought I'll go and do a check. It had been sort of 20 minutes or so before we last checked, so I'll go and do a check before the food arrives. So I just walked out of the restaurant up the hill. I passed Jerry down that way. Because I think if you'd have been looking at me, because I would have said something, because Kate had been moaning that you'd been gone a long time watching the football.
I'm almost certain that when I came over and he was here, and I was like that.
In 2013, when the Metropolitan Police in the United Kingdom conducted a review of the case under Operation Grange, the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann recorded a significant shift related to the statement of witness Jane Tanner, a member of the holiday group commonly referred to as the Tapas 7. For 6 years, Tanner had maintained that at around 9:15 p.m., she saw a man carrying a young girl in light-colored sleepwear walking along the street near apartment 5A, and that detail became central to the theory that Madeleine had left the apartment at that time. However, during a private interview with Operation Grange investigators, Tanner confirmed that the man she had seen was actually a British tourist who had been taking his own daughter back to their room from the Ocean Club childcare service. Once the man's identity was verified, the statement that had long been considered a key element in the case timeline was no longer applicable. This forced investigators to reassess the entire assumption surrounding the 9:15 p.m. timeframe, which had previously been viewed as a critical moment connected to Madeleine's departure from the apartment. During several days of private interviews with Operation Grange investigators, Jane Tanner recounted what happened after Madeleine McCann was discovered missing. According to Tanner, in the early hours of May 4, 2007, as panic spread, the McCann family and the holiday group gathered inside apartment 5A to organize the events of the previous night. Exhausted and under intense stress, the group began writing down the times each person left and returned to the dinner table based on what they could remember. The notes were written on the back of one of Madeleine's storybooks, originally intended to assist the authorities. However, Tanner stated that the process gradually turned into an effort to shape a unified sequence of events before official statements were taken. During these discussions, the members' memories were influenced by pressure and by the way details were adjusted as they interacted with one another. Certain elements changed when someone recalled a different time marker or order of events. According to professional documentation, this phenomenon aligns with the concept of group memory contamination, in which individual recollections are affected by stress, collective discussion, and the desire to create a cohesive narrative. As a result, the note-taking process was not only an attempt to reconstruct information, but also a reflection of an unconscious self-protective tendency, as no one wanted to give an account that differed from the others, or confront the possibility that there had been shortcomings in supervising the children at the time the incident occurred. For the investigators working on Operation Grange, Jane Tanner's revised account opened a new perspective on how the Tapas 7 reconstructed the night of the incident. What Tanner described suggested that the consistency in the group's statements arose mainly from a natural response to an extremely stressful situation, as everyone tried to arrange the events in an orderly timeline rather than from any intention to conceal information. During the review, investigators identified several discrepancies between the original handwritten notes and the later official statements, including changes in the times people left the table, missing names in the timeline, and differences in the descriptions of the checks that were believed to confirm Madeleine was still safe. These inconsistencies weakened the theory that relied heavily on the 9:15 p.m. marker. Instead of being treated as a fixed moment, that time frame was reassessed as the product of a collective reconstruction shaped by pressure and by the individual memories of each member of the group. In reconstructing the events on the night Madeleine McCann was reported missing, the Tapas bar was described as the setting for the holiday group's activities before the incident occurred. According to the statements, the evening unfolded normally until Madeleine was no longer in the room, forcing the group to recall every detail and arrange the sequence of events. The following morning, they began forming a shared timeline based on each person's memory. These notes reflected a natural collective reaction to a crisis in which consistency was prioritized over precision. Jane Tanner's later clarification did not assign blame or imply intentional wrongdoing by anyone. Instead, it emphasized the phenomenon of memory alignment, in which individuals experiencing the same event unconsciously adjust their accounts to achieve cohesion. Investigators noted that this process could blur details that had not yet been firmly established, details that were important for analyzing what actually happened. Tanner's decision to clarify her statement underscored how strongly human memory is influenced by stress and how easily it can shift according to context. The long-standing consistency in the Tapas 7's statements, built on the handwritten timeline and overlapping recollections, showed that a unified narrative is not necessarily the result of concealment, but may arise from confusion and the instinct to maintain coherence when confronted with a serious event. One major question raised during the investigation was why the detail about the window appeared so early in the initial account. In the first few hours after Madeleine McCann was reported missing, information about a window being disturbed and a shutter possibly opened from the outside quickly became central to the family's belief that someone had accessed the apartment. However, when forensic specialists examined apartment 5A in Praia da Luz, they found no indication that the window or shutter had been interfered with. The frame was intact. The mechanism worked normally, and the layer of dust on the windowsill showed no signs of disruption. According to professional assessment, if the window had been opened from the outside, there would have been mechanical marks or scratches showing some form of contact, but no such evidence was found. This raised questions about why the window detail was included in the story from the very beginning, even though it was something that could be easily verified. The presence of this element in the early account became one of the most debated points, highlighting the gap between the initial assumptions formed under intense stress and the later on-site forensic findings. To explain why the window detail appeared in the earliest accounts, investigators revisited the moments in the early morning of May 4, 2007, when information was being shared under intense pressure and urgency at the Ocean Club complex. When authorities and the media arrived, they recorded several consistent statements from the McCann family's relatives and friends about the possibility that someone had accessed the apartment through the children's bedroom window. Trish Cameron, Jerry McCann's sister, said she received a call around midnight during which Jerry told her that when Kate checked at 10:00 p.m., the front door was open and the bedroom window appeared unusual. Brian Healy, Madeleine's grandfather, also stated that Jerry mentioned the shutter was not in its normal position, which caused the family to worry that someone might have taken Madeleine out of the apartment. John Corner, a close friend of Kate and godfather to the twins, described a panicked call from Kate in which she said the shutter seemed to have been opened and Madeleine was no longer in the room. Another friend, Jill Renwick, said she was told that the group had been checking the apartment at intervals and believed the bedroom shutter had been opened before Madeleine was found missing. These statements, given in a moment of intense stress, quickly formed a unified narrative about the window, turning it into a central detail in the initial belief that someone had approached apartment 5A from the outside. 4 different witnesses, in 4 separate phone calls, all recounted the same details about the condition of the apartment at the time Madeleine McCann was reported missing. This level of consistency drew the attention of analysts because it was not the type of information that spreads and changes as it circulates. Instead, these were direct accounts from people who had spoken with the McCann family on the very night of the incident. All 4 mentioned 3 common points. The apartment was believed to have been secured. The bedroom shutter appeared unusual, and there was a possibility that someone had approached the window area before leaving through the front door. The uniformity of these accounts made the window detail a central part of the initial narrative, even though later forensic examination of apartment 5A showed no physical evidence supporting this assumption. However, when forensic specialists examined apartment 5A, their findings contradicted the early descriptions. The shutter showed no signs of damage, the lock had not been disturbed, and the window frame displayed no scratches or indications of outside interference. Based on these observations, Portuguese investigators concluded that accessing the apartment through the window was inconsistent with the physical evidence, because if any force had been applied, the scene would have shown clear marks. The contrast between the initial accounts and the forensic results kept the window narrative under continued scrutiny throughout the case analysis, as it highlighted the gap between early assumptions formed under extreme stress and the factual data documented afterward. At around 9:10 p.m., Jerry McCann had a brief conversation with neighbor Jez Wilkins outside the apartment area, and this is regarded as one of the key time markers before Madeleine was reported missing. This encounter is often used as a reference point when establishing the sequence of events that night. During the case file review, some documents mentioned the possibility that Wilkins's presence was a factor that drew investigators' attention when reassessing the early accounts related to the window. However, there is no factual evidence indicating that this conversation was directly connected to the initial descriptions of the window or shutter. The official conclusions simply noted that the window detail in the early account was inconsistent with the forensic findings, and the meeting between Jerry McCann and Jez Wilkins was merely part of the timeline used to verify the sequence of events. At around 1:00 a.m., a few hours after Madeleine McCann was reported missing, Jerry McCann returned to knock on the door of neighbor Jez Wilkins. According to Wilkins's wife, the knocking was urgent, and when Wilkins opened the door, Jerry informed him that his daughter was gone. Wilkins offered to help search, but Jerry said he did not need assistance at that moment. This detail was documented in the case file because it formed part of the night's sequence of events, especially since Jerry and Wilkins had already spoken briefly at around 9:10 p.m. near the apartment area. Some later analytical reports mentioned the 1:00 a.m. visit when cross-checking the timeline. However, there is no evidence indicating that this interaction was directly connected to the initial descriptions involving the window. The forensic results from apartment 5A later became the decisive factor, showing that the window detail in the early account did not match the actual condition of the scene and was not supported by physical evidence. When the various accounts were compared, inconsistencies began to emerge. John Corner recalled that Kate told him both the front door and the patio door were locked when they left the apartment for dinner, implying there was no easy access for an outsider. Trish Cameron, however, said that Jerry described the front door as being open and also mentioned the bedroom window and shutter as part of the issue. On May 4th, Jerry's sister Philomena McCann told the press that people might question why the McCanns had left the children in the apartment, but she insisted the apartment was locked, that they could see the entrance, and that they were checking at regular intervals. In contrast, Jill Renwick stressed in her account that the bedroom shutter had been opened from the outside. All of these accounts used the same descriptive framework: locked doors, a disturbed shutter, an open window, but when placed side by side, the specific details did not match. If the patio door was locked from the inside and the front door required a key to open, the likelihood of a stranger entering and leaving without leaving clear traces was very low. And if subsequent forensic examination showed that the window bore no signs of forced opening, then the theory that someone had approached and left through that route also became difficult to sustain. It was precisely this conflict between elements that forced investigators to reconsider the original assumption of an outside intruder entering apartment 5A and to reassess the entire narrative with greater caution. The inconsistencies in the various accounts reveal the difference between the initial assumptions shaped in a moment of panic and the conclusions based on the actual physical evidence at the scene. In that context, the window detail became notable because it appeared very early in the initial accounts, even though it was not supported by the later forensic findings. Its repeated mention in the first phone calls and early retellings reflected how those present at the time were searching for a clear explanation in a situation that felt out of control. This caused the possibility of outside access to apartment 5A to receive more attention than other scenarios. Once the window detail was introduced into the story from the outset, it influenced perception and made the theory of outside interference the central focus of the early narrative, even though the real evidence did not support such a conclusion. This shows that the window detail played a significant role in shaping the initial assumptions, not because it was verified, but because it emerged as part of the early accounts formed during a period of stress and limited clear information. When police officially dismissed the idea that the window of apartment 5A had been opened from the outside, the detail had already become familiar to the public because it had been repeated so many times in the media. Television reports continually referred to an opened window. Newspapers published diagrams illustrating a supposed point of entry, and images of the shutter were used to reinforce the early narrative. However, forensic findings showed that the patio door was locked from the inside. The shutter displayed no signs of being forced, and there was no indication of interference with the window frame. When these factors were compared, there was no viable point of entry from the outside that aligned with the actual condition of apartment 5A. This made the theory of outside access through the window, central to the early accounts formed in a chaotic moment, no longer compatible when examined under forensic standards and technical analysis. Apartment 5A was a ground-floor corner unit with 2 points of entry: the front door facing the street and the sliding patio door that opened onto a small garden area overlooking the pool. The children's bedroom was next to a window facing the road, with a street lamp positioned directly outside. If the theory of someone accessing the room through that window were considered, the person would have had to climb over a waist-high wall, reach the shutter and window without making noticeable noise, open a path into the bedroom, approach a sleeping child, and then leave the same way without leaving clear traces such as fingerprints, contact marks, or fibers. When this sequence of actions was tested, forensic specialists assessed the likelihood of it being carried out discreetly and without leaving identifiable signs as extremely low. Ultimately, the detail of a disturbed window could no longer be treated as a factual report, but rather as the starting point of a narrative formed under stress and a lack of clear information. Whether it originated from initial panic or from the need to impose order on a chaotic situation, this element significantly shaped how the scene was interpreted. shifting attention away from possibilities inside the apartment and toward the theory of outside access. The actual conditions in apartment 5A showed that the shutter bore no signs of interference, and the window frame remained intact. Yet the story that spread publicly became tied to the image of an entry through the window and a child leaving the bed under circumstances that had not been verified. The physical evidence presented a more cautious picture, reflecting technical observations rather than assumptions formed hastily. However, in the first hours of the incident, the window detail became an anchor for the initial hypothesis and continued to persist for years afterward, even as forensic analysis and later investigative findings demonstrated that it did not correspond with the real data. When investigators examined apartment 5A after Madeleine McCann was reported missing, they discovered not just one but 4 handwritten time records describing the events of the evening of May 3, 2007. 3 were found inside the apartment, 2 sets of notes and a timeline hastily written on the back of one of Madeleine's storybooks, and the 4th was found in Kate McCann's handbag. At first, these notes appeared to be a reasonable effort to document information during a moment of intense stress. However, when compared in detail, the differences between them showed how unstable memory can be under pressure. The times people left the table were recorded in multiple ways. The descriptions of the checks did not fully match, and certain details appeared or disappeared between versions. These variations reflected confusion and the psychological impact on the group in the first hours of the incident, rather than a sequence of events that could be verified by physical evidence. All 4 timelines followed the same basic structure. The group had dinner at the Tapas restaurant, took turns leaving the table every 20 to 30 minutes to check on the sleeping children, and at around 10:00 p.m., Kate McCann discovered that Madeleine was no longer in the room. However, when investigators compared the individual records, they found differences that went beyond what could be explained by ordinary stress. The handwriting varied, the way times were described was inconsistent, and certain details appeared in one version but disappeared in another. Upon deeper analysis, the level of consistency across the notes decreased, indicating that the process of remembering and reconstructing the events had been significantly affected by the chaos and psychological pressure in the first hours after the incident. In one version of the timeline, Matt Oldfield stated that he went to the apartment at around 9:30 p.m., entered through the unlocked patio door, saw the twins sleeping, and observed Madeleine in her bed. This detail created an important reference point because it was treated as the last confirmation that Madeleine was safe before 10:00 p.m. However, in another handwritten record believed to have been created after that night, Matt's account changed significantly. Instead of saying he saw Madeleine, he described standing at the doorway and hearing breathing coming from inside the room. The difference between direct visual confirmation and relying only on sound is substantial, because seeing the child establishes a firm time marker, while hearing a noise cannot confirm whether it came from Madeleine's bed or from the twins. A similar situation appears in the case of Russell O'Brien. Some notes describe him leaving the table to check on his daughter and incidentally observing the McCann children's room, while in other versions, his name is absent altogether. These small changes carried major consequences in the context of the investigation. A single added or omitted detail could shift the entire timeline and directly affect the assessment of each witness's reliability. Investigators quickly realized that these written records were not simply neutral recollections. They reflected the formation of an evolving narrative, adjusted as the group tried to reconcile memories that did not fully align with one another. This did not necessarily indicate intentional concealment, but pointed to a more natural phenomenon. Human memory can become distorted under pressure, especially when those involved are trying to make sense of a chaotic and emotionally charged situation. The psychology behind these inconsistencies was significant. Throughout the evening, the Tapas 7 had been drinking alcohol, talking, and enjoying their vacation. No one was tracking time or checking watches with precision. When the incident occurred, they suddenly had to describe their actions in near forensic detail. Panic made their memories unclear, and by the following morning, when questioned by police, the adults responded in a way commonly observed in high-pressure groups. They reconstructed the evening together. They placed fragments of memory side by side, comparing details until their stories began to align. However, alignment did not equal accuracy. In that highly emotional space, they were worried not only about Madeleine, but also about themselves. Each parent had left their children alone in the apartment, and they understood that this could expose them to harsh public judgment or even accusations of irresponsibility. This vulnerability created what psychologists call protective synchronization, a group dynamic in which individuals unconsciously adjust their memories to form a unified version of events that feels more socially acceptable. Their consistent retelling did not necessarily reflect deliberate distortion. It functioned as a self-protective mechanism to shield themselves from guilt, pressure, and shame in the overwhelming circumstances they faced. Imagine the scene just after 9 p.m. at the Tapas bar. The warm glow of lanterns swayed gently. The conversation continued, but was slowly interrupted by glances at the clock, as each person stood up in turn to check on the children. Only a few hours later, Kate's panicked cry tore through the night, and the table that had been filled with laughter suddenly became the center of a shared shock none of them could have imagined. In the chaotic first hours, they gathered inside apartment 5A, with a notebook and pen placed in the middle of the table, half-finished drinks still sitting nearby as traces of an evening abruptly broken. In that confined space, everything they wrote down and tried to remember was colored by confusion, fear, and a desperate need to make sense of what had just happened. The group's silence did not come from a coordinated plan or any kind of secret agreement, but emerged naturally from fear, shame, and mutual dependence in a moment far beyond what anyone could emotionally withstand. It was a self-protective mechanism hidden beneath the appearance of unity. That is why, when speaking of collective silence, one should not imagine a pact forged in the shadows, but rather an instinctive reaction from people clinging to one another in the midst of chaos. They avoided revisiting that night, not to conceal something terrible, but because every detail spoken aloud risked forcing them to confront the possibility that they had failed. They understood that if every memory were laid bare exactly as it happened, the single bond holding them together might fracture. And so, no deliberate strategy or coordinated effort was necessary. The shared mixture of fear, self-preservation, and the need for emotional support from the person beside them was enough for 7 individuals to hold on to a common story they believed they could survive. The truth did not vanish because they intentionally hid it, but faded under the weight of blurred memories, self-protective instinct, and deeply human emotional limits. In the end, their silence was not a conspiracy. It was the only way they knew to keep functioning in the wake of a shock that would have overwhelmed anyone. In the late afternoon of May 3, 2007, as the sun began to sink over Praia de Luz, the adults in the Tapas 7 group settled into their familiar holiday routine. They gathered around the pool area, talking and enjoying a few light alcoholic drinks while taking in the relaxed atmosphere of an early evening in Portugal. By the time they sat down for dinner at the Ocean Club's Tapas bar, several hours had passed, and multiple refills were noted throughout the meal. A mix of cocktails and common alcoholic beverages was consumed, creating the typical ambiance of a vacation evening. All of this was ordinary for a holiday setting. But later, the amount of alcohol consumed that night became a factor that significantly influenced how the group remembered the events once the incident occurred. When the evening descended into chaos and Madeleine McCann was discovered no longer in the room, the only thing the Tapas 7 group could rely on to describe what had happened was memory. However, the light alcoholic drinks they had consumed earlier became a major influencing factor, because scientific studies show that such beverages significantly affect the ability to accurately recall events. They do not erase memory completely, but they impair the brain's ability to encode information and perceive time correctly. As a result, although the group could remember the general sequence of events, what happened before and after, specific details such as exact times or the length of each moment became blurred and easily distorted. Time in their memories stretched and contracted in unpredictable ways. A few minutes could feel like half an hour, and half an hour could pass without anyone noticing. When stress layered on top of the effects of light alcoholic drinks, the distortion became even greater. The combination of alcohol, panic, and the pressure to produce a coherent explanation became the filter through which the Tapas 7 remembered the night Madeleine McCann was found missing. The timeline they reconstructed was never based on objective data. There was no clock at the dinner table, no time-stamped images, and no CCTV footage to verify movements in and out. Everything relied on perception, the rhythm of the meal, the flow of conversation, and each person's subjective sense of how long they had been away from the table. When they described checking on the children, those estimates became the pillars of the entire narrative. Jerry McCann was said to have checked at 9:05 p.m. Jane Tanner claimed she saw a man carrying a child at 9:15 p.m. Matt Oldfield checked again at 9:30 p.m. Kate discovered Madeleine missing at 10 o'clock p.m. On paper, the structure of these time markers appears logical, but in reality, it was built entirely on subjective perception clouded by fatigue, stress, and the lingering effects of the light alcoholic drinks consumed earlier that evening. Independent witnesses pointed out inconsistencies almost immediately. Staff at the Tapas restaurant reported that some members of the group were away from the table much longer than the handwritten timelines suggested. But if certain people were gone for up to half an hour, while others left shortly after, the rotation system they described would have been impossible to maintain the way it was presented, and in reality, it never operated smoothly in that manner. According to the group's own statements, the sliding patio door of apartment 5A was locked from the inside, meaning that any parent returning to check on the children had to take the longer route, down the steps, around the building, in through the main entrance, and back to the apartment. That journey alone took at least 10 minutes per round. Once multiple families took turns performing these checks, the numbers stopped aligning. A check supposedly occurring every 30 minutes would require an almost regimented schedule, something unrealistic while they were talking, drinking light alcoholic beverages, and waiting for dinner service. The only way the system could have functioned as described was if the patio door had been left open, an assumption that introduced safety concerns and questions of responsibility. Yet in the group's collective memory, the checking system existed as a fully formed structure, They remembered it not because it made logistical sense, but because it played a crucial role in how they attempted to make sense of an evening that had spiraled out of control. The version of the timeline recorded by the Tapas 7 helped them justify their choices, soften their sense of responsibility, and create the impression that they had maintained control over a situation that was, in reality, uncontrollable. In that sense, the timeline was not merely a record of events, but a self-protective mechanism, an attempt to impose order on the chaos of the evening. When investigators reconstructed the actual sequence, they noted that Jerry McCann left the table at around 9:05 p.m. to check on the children. A few minutes later, Jane Tanner walked past the area in front of the apartment and reported seeing a man carrying a child. As Jerry returned, he had a brief conversation with neighbor Jez Wilkins outside the complex, and the two men later recalled the encounter differently. According to the group's account, Matt Oldfield then went to check at around 9:30 p.m., entered through the unlocked patio door, and heard steady breathing but did not directly see Madeleine. At around 10 o'clock p.m., Kate McCann returned to the apartment and found the window open and Madeleine's bed empty. Accepting this sequence requires assuming that each check was performed at precise, evenly spaced intervals without interruption. Even though no one was using a watch, no one took real-time notes, and there was no shared device to determine the time objectively. In reality, what they created was not a complete timeline, but something closer to a mosaic of disconnected possibilities, arranged to give the impression of unity and certainty. Psychologists who study eyewitness memory under the influence of light alcoholic drinks have found that even a small amount can reduce temporal accuracy by roughly 40%. Participants in these studies could describe what they had done, but they rarely identified the exact time they did it. They also showed a strong tendency toward overconfidence. The less certain they felt, the more forcefully they asserted the version they believed was correct. This paradox aligns closely with how the Tapas 7 operated on the night Madeleine McCann was reported missing. With no objective verification tools available, their confidence became the foundation that reinforced the group's narrative. One person's memory supported another's, forming a closed loop of belief. However, outside that loop, inconsistencies began to appear. The waitstaff's accounts did not match theirs. Some resort guests recalled seeing group members walking around at different times. Even within the group itself, contradictions existed. Some said the door was locked, others said it was open. Some believed they had seen Madeleine. Others only heard sounds from the room. Some insisted checks happened every 30 minutes. Others maintained it was around 20. These discrepancies were not lies in the typical sense, but the natural outcome of human perception under pressure and stress. The effect of light alcoholic drinks on event memory clarifies this well. Event memory, the type that records our experiences in sequence like a mental film, does not disappear under the influence of alcohol. But the frame rate of that film slows, causing the timing, rhythm, and continuity of events to become imprecise and easily disrupted. As events began to blend, overlap, and eclipse one another, people could remember how they felt in a given moment, but struggled to pinpoint when it happened. They knew they had left the table but were unsure whether it was before or after someone else. And when several people took part in similar actions, the confusion multiplied exponentially. Once the shock occurred, everything became even more chaotic. The moment Kate McCann cried out that her daughter was gone, everything that had happened beforehand was instantly drowned in panic. And the brain, trying to impose order on the disorder, began rearranging memories based on emotion rather than on chronological sequence. Anxiety became the only adhesive, and what followed was no longer true recollection, but reconstruction, mapping fragments of memory that were pieced together in an information-starved setting. Viewed logically, the Tapas 7's child-checking system reveals flaws that cannot hold up. If the apartment was locked from the inside, the rotation pattern they described was nearly impossible. Yet if the door was left open, the sense of safety they insisted upon became contradictory. Either way, their confidence in that system did not align with the level of vigilance they claimed. But in the minds of those involved, the two could coexist because memory operates not on logic, but on psychological need. They needed to believe they had done enough. Needed to believe the plan they created had worked. The result was a timeline that appeared cohesive when written down but fell apart under backward scrutiny. It had rhythm but lacked the precision required in the absence of corroborating evidence. As one investigator described it, this was a map drawn after the journey, not during it, where each note was an approximation and each timestamp an attempt to hammer certainty into a space that had never been certain at she. From this perspective, the Tapas 7 did not conceal the truth in a deliberate sense, but unintentionally blurred it under the natural limitations of human memory and the influence of alcohol. The detailed time spans described between 8:30 p.m. and 10 o'clock p.m. were not precise minute-by-minute records, but rather a shared sense of order constructed in panic. They were the product of adults desperately trying to impose coherence after a devastating event. In the end, the timeline of that night reflected exactly what the investigation later confirmed. It was not seamless, but resembled a collage, with overlapping fragments of memory shaped by emotion, fatigue, and the effects of alcohol. The pieces seemed to fit only when viewed from a distance, an improvised version of order, accepted because it met the psychological need for certainty. Perhaps this is the case's greatest paradox. The truth of what happened to Madeleine McCann was not intentionally hidden. It was obscured by the natural limits of human memory, shaped by fear and mental turmoil. And in the long shadow of the Madeleine McCann case, one question remains. What held 7 adults, people with overlapping memories, differing experiences, and immense pressure, together in silence and unity for more than 16 years? To this day, that remains an unanswered mystery. From this perspective, the solidarity of the Tapas 7, maintained even under intense scrutiny from the media and investigators, led the public to label them with the phrase, "pact of silence." Yet the real question is whether that silence came from a deliberate plan or from deeply human reactions shaped by fear and psychology. When stripped of sensationalism, 5 possible explanations emerge, each revealing a different layer of instinctive self-protection. The first and most understandable explanation is the need to protect oneself. Every member of the Tapas group had left their children asleep alone in apartment 5A or in nearby units while they dined at the Tapas restaurant. When Madeleine McCann disappeared, their collective responsibility instantly became the focal point. To the public, they were no longer simply friends on holiday. They became an example of inadequate vigilance in child supervision. If even one person admitted that the patio door had been left open, or that the checks were not as regular as claimed, or that they heard something unusual and did nothing, the sense of guilt would spread to the entire group. In the chaotic first hours, when the media converged on Praia da Luz and Portuguese police began gathering statements, the instinct to protect one another took hold. They formed a closed psychological circle in which no one wanted to break the unity. Each of them described the child-checking system with equal confidence, emphasizing the regular rotation and the sense of safety they believed they had maintained. The reality that this system contained gaps, relied on memory rather than documentation, and depended more on trust than on any structured procedure, was obscured by psychological pressure. Admitting mistakes meant facing both personal and collective failure. By contrast, remaining silent or holding firmly to the same narrative created a sense of safety. This kind of self-defense does not require coordination or organized concealment. It arises naturally from fear and from the desire to protect one another. It was an unspoken understanding that their lives, careers, and reputations were tightly intertwined, and a single statement drifting away from the shared narrative could trigger serious consequences. The second possibility, less intentional but deeper and more subconscious, is a form of psychological masking. Psychologists note that when people face guilt too overwhelming to process, they tend to reshape their memories to ease internal conflict. This is not deceit. It is a self-protective mechanism. After Madeleine McCann disappeared, each member of the Tapas 7 was forced to confront a heavy, unsettling possibility. We should have done more, rather than live under that weight. Their collective memory gradually formed in a way that shielded them. They began to believe that the doors had always been secure, that the checks were consistent, that every step had been done properly. Over time, reassurance transformed into certainty in their minds. In interviews, they did not speak as though they were recalling. They spoke as though they were repeating a familiar script. The timeline became rigid. Jerry checked at 9:05 p.m. Jane saw a suspicious stranger carrying a child at 9:15 p.m. Matt checked again at 9:30 p.m. Kate found the window open at 10 o'clock p.m. The sequence sounded pre-shaped because, in reality, it was the product of group memory contamination, where repeated retelling blurs the line between what truly happened and what has been reconstructed. This form of unconscious masking did not arise from malice, but from the need to protect themselves from crushing guilt and responsibility. This need grew out of their emotional survival. The group needed to believe they had acted responsibly, because anything else would force them to confront the unbearable idea that they had contributed, even indirectly, to the event that led to Madeleine McCann's disappearance. The third explanation carries a heavier tone: the possibility that only some members of the group held the full picture. As one commentator remarked in 2010, "Perhaps we're talking about the Tapas 2, not the Tapas 7. This hypothesis suggests that one or two people within the group may have known things that were never shared with the others. If what happened to Madeleine stemmed from an unexpected incident inside the apartment, such as a medical issue or a sudden mishap during childcare, then the McCanns may have confided privately in the people they trusted most. Those individuals, in the chaotic first hours, might have guided the overall narrative by offering suggestions, reframing the timeline, or reassuring the others to maintain unity. The remaining members, without full information, could have followed that lead unconsciously, relying on mutual trust and the ambiguity of the situation. This hypothesis may also help explain the strange inconsistencies in the statements. Why certain checks appear in one version but disappear in another. Why some individuals became guarded under deeper questioning. Why the group's later statements sounded rehearsed. A scenario of partial consensus does not require the entire group to participate in concealment. Only a few key individuals would need to know more than they disclosed, while the rest would, without realizing it, repeat a story that had already been subtly shaped for them. The fourth factor that sustained the unity of the Tapas 7 came from media pressure. From the moment the case became an international headline, the entire group was thrust under an unforgiving spotlight. Reporters gathered outside the apartment. Newspapers published photos of them dining in the days before the incident, and online forums dissected their every gesture, making an already fragile private life even more unbearable. In that environment, even the slightest discrepancy between statements could become fuel for endless speculation. The group quickly realized that the safest response was to speak as little as possible. This led to a defensive, almost hibernation-like state, avoiding interviews, avoiding debates, and refraining from making any public adjustments to the original narrative. The quieter they remained, the fewer opportunities they left for criticism. Over time, that silence was interpreted from the outside as a form of concealment, and the media labeled it a pact of silence, even though for the Tapas 7, it may simply have been a way to protect themselves from overwhelming public pressure. The fifth motive, deeply personal and perhaps the most powerful, was the fear of losing their children. In the United Kingdom, when parental behavior is judged to be severely negligent, child protection agencies can intervene. If the group's actions were viewed as irresponsible, the consequences would extend beyond reputational damage and could threaten family stability. For the McCanns, this was especially sensitive, as their two younger children were still in their early years. In that context, maintaining unity, whether through silence or caution, became the most understandable choice to avoid magnifying risks that could further endanger their lives. Across the entire Tapas 7, not only the McCanns, admitting that they had left their children alone in unlocked rooms hundreds of meters away while drinking light alcoholic beverages meant acknowledging behavior that could be viewed as insufficiently cautious for parents. Even without the risk of legal consequences, public judgment alone could be devastating. In the eyes of colleagues, friends, or professionals in their fields, the image of carelessness could follow them for years. In that situation, choosing silence was not only a moral decision, it was an instinctive reaction to protect their families and their children. Oversharing meant accepting unnecessary risk. These 5 factors combined to create a closed psychological mechanism sustained by dependence, pressure, and unspoken loyalty. What began as simple friendship evolved into a form of tight cohesion as they faced scrutiny from the public and the media. The more attention they received from the outside, the more they clung to one another, protecting each other, yet also being held in place by that same bond. In that psychological space, silence became their mode of communication. Meanwhile, speculation from the outside continued to intensify. The more questions the public raised, the more the group withdrew. When police revisited their statements months later, their answers had become rigidly uniform. The same questions produced almost identical answers, word for word, as though everything had settled into a default narrative. Yet behind that consistency, the signs of imperfection were still easy to see. One detail that has raised questions in the case file is Jerry McCann knocking on Jez Wilkins's door at around 1:00 a.m., only to decline the offer of help in searching. This action is not clearly explained in any official investigative document and remains unresolved to this day. In addition, over time, certain parts of the Tapas 7 members' statements shifted slightly, such as the wording changing from "I saw" to "I think I saw," or differences regarding whether the door was locked, when the window was open, and who conducted each check. These variations do not provide conclusive evidence but reflect the instability of memory under pressure. From an investigative perspective, these small inconsistencies suggest that the situation was not driven by an organized plan but was shaped by the natural limits of human memory when confronted with stress, fear, and intense public scrutiny. In that environment, the Tapas 7 gradually maintained unity in their statements, not as a formal agreement, but as a natural response to avoid additional risk and preserve stability for the entire group throughout the lengthy investigation. The story of the Tapas 7 shows that the truth of the case was not hidden through manipulation, but was obscured by natural human reactions under pressure. The moments of silence or small shifts in their statements reflect the limits of memory and the instinct for self-protection, not a coordinated plan. In that setting, each person unconsciously contributed to the ambiguity of the events. Their silence did not aim to conceal wrongdoing, but grew out of fear that they might have been insufficiently cautious and out of the intense scrutiny placed upon them. Madeleine McCann's disappearance quickly moved beyond the scope of a typical missing child search and became an international media spectacle. Just days after May 3, 2007, the resort town of Praia da Luz was flooded with reporters, photographers, and television crews, while networks broadcast live from outside the Ocean Club around the clock. Newspapers ran endless headlines of speculation and debate, adding pressure on the McCann family and on a local investigative system already struggling to balance proper procedure with overwhelming public attention. In that chaos, the first person to become a target of suspicion was Robert Murat, a British resident living near apartment 5A. Even though there was no verified evidence against him at the time, fluent in both English and Portuguese, Robert Murat volunteered as an interpreter for police during the early stages of the investigation. However, his frequent presence near the scene and his familiarity with the area quickly made him a target of speculation. Some reporters described his behavior and demeanor as unusual, allowing rumors to spread rapidly. Within only a few weeks, under intense media pressure, Portuguese authorities formally identified Murat as a suspect. His home was searched, his personal devices were seized, and his private life was pushed onto front pages across Europe. Months later, when test results and forensic analyses found nothing incriminating, he was quietly cleared. But by then, Murat's reputation had already suffered significant damage. He later won lawsuits and received compensation from several British tabloids for their speculative reporting. Murat's situation reflected the challenges of the investigation: rapid but inconsistent responses, at times influenced more by public opinion than by evidence. While reporters closely followed the McCann family and searched for clues around Praia da Luz, major procedural errors occurred in the very first hours. One notable issue was that police allowed the McCanns to wash their clothes within 48 hours of Madeleine's disappearance, something rarely permitted in an investigation involving a serious incident. In addition, their rental car and personal items were not seized immediately, but were left at the scene for weeks. By the time forensic teams returned to examine them, it was highly likely that important traces such as fibers, micro-evidence, or biological indicators had been disturbed or were no longer intact. The Portuguese police's early decisions, originally intended to show compassion toward the McCann family, unintentionally compromised the integrity of the scene. Months later, when a specialist team from the United Kingdom was brought in, they used cadaver dogs and blood detection dogs to re-examine the apartment and the Renault Scenic the family had rented more than 3 weeks after Madeleine McCann disappeared. Both dogs alerted in 2 locations: behind the sofa in the living room and in the storage compartment of the car. The Portuguese authorities interpreted these reactions as indications that human decomposition may have been present in those areas. The McCann family rejected that conclusion and offered several alternative explanations. such as a child possibly having a minor injury, nosebleeds, dirty diapers, or spoiled food in the trash. They also suggested that Madeleine's toys might have carried lingering odors from the hospital where Kate worked. Although these explanations did not align with forensic protocols, they complicated the discussion and slowed the investigative process. At the same time, the Portuguese police, PJ, faced criticism from international media for their handling of the case. News outlets described them as inexperienced in managing a globally scrutinized investigation. In response, the PJ claimed that outside interference and pressure from the United Kingdom made cooperation more difficult. The relationship between the two sides gradually shifted into bureaucratic conflict. Some documents were delayed due to translation issues, and many requests for evidence took significant time to process, further prolonging the investigation. What was originally intended to be a coordinated investigative effort between the United Kingdom and Portugal quickly split into two parallel tracks, each side pursuing its own procedures. When Scotland Yard launched its independent inquiry, Operation Grange, many hoped it would bring new progress in uncovering what happened to Madeleine McCann. But the operation gradually took on a political character rather than a purely investigative one, serving partly to review the case and partly to demonstrate that the UK remained actively involved. Despite costing more than £13 million, the inquiry produced no major breakthroughs. Most of the work involved re-examining old leads, re-interviewing witnesses, and even revisiting hypotheses the Portuguese police had already dismissed. Meanwhile, both Portugal's Polícia Judiciária and Scotland Yard were under heavy pressure from public opinion and diplomatic expectations, forcing them to devote significant energy to media management rather than focusing fully on forensic work. This became a structural limitation. The case sat at the crossroads of international media attention, diplomatic sensitivity, and cultural differences in investigative practice. Decisions, from evidence handling to press releases, were shaped not only by investigative needs, but by how they would appear on television. In Portugal, suspicion about British influence grew. In the UK, the McCann family faced both sympathy and criticism. In this environment, the narrative surrounding the case attracted more attention than the investigative data itself, making the search for truth increasingly difficult. As the parties involved, including the press, the investigative forces, and government authorities, gradually developed their own interpretations of the events, a form of systemic silence began to emerge. By 2020, the case appeared to take a new turn when German prosecutors identified Christian Bruckner, a man with a prior record involving wrongful conduct and illicit activities, as a potential suspect. He had lived in the Algarve region at the time Madeleine McCann disappeared, and cell phone data showed that Bruckner's device was near Praia da Luz on the night of the incident. It was the first time in 13 years that an official authority had publicly stated, with a notable degree of confidence, that they had a primary suspect. Yet behind the prominent headlines, most of the information remained speculative. There was no DNA, no direct witnesses, and no confession. Only indications of geographic coincidence and indirect data. Bruckner denied any involvement, while German authorities withheld details, citing procedural regulations. As time passed without clear progress, the investigation once again slipped into a familiar stalemate by 2024. The Bruckner development highlighted a pattern present throughout the entire investigative process. Any piece of information that initially appeared solid quickly dissolved under closer scrutiny. Each new wave of public attention overwrote the previous one, leaving even more ambiguity behind. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann, widely considered the most closely followed case of a missing child in the world, gradually transformed into a complex, reflective system, where confusion, pressure, and expectation outweighed actual evidence. If the silence of the Tapas group reflected instinctive self-protection in a moment of acute stress, then the silence from the surrounding institutions reflected the effects of administrative procedures, information limits, and broader issues of coordination and capability. Portuguese police, British investigators, the media, and even online users were all pulled into an environment in which noise was encouraged while caution received little attention. The more the case was discussed, the fewer people seemed to truly listen. After 17 years, the question still lingers around apartment 5A. What if every initial assumption was wrong? From the investigators' interpretations to the way the press reported the story, and even the witnesses' accounts, the answer may never fully take shape. What began as the search for a missing child gradually expanded into a broader picture, revealing how truth can be buried beneath the very echoes produced by the systems meant to uncover it. From that perspective, the Madeleine McCann case is not only the story of an unresolved disappearance, but also a warning about how a system made up of law enforcement, the media, and the public can become trapped in a loop of silence, distortion, and mutual expectation. 16 years after that night in Praia da Luz, the case remains anchored in the public consciousness, not just because it is unsolved, but because it has become a mirror reflecting society's deepest fears: the fear for children's safety, the anxiety surrounding unpredictable events, and the need to construct a complete narrative to explain the inexplicable. Each anniversary, each suspect revisited, and each circulating lead reignites the unease that has persisted since 2007. Many researchers refer to this phenomenon as the Madeleine McCann effect, a profound shift in cultural perception about risk and responsibility, and a testament to how a single disappearance can shape the collective anxieties of an entire era. Across Europe, many parents who had once left their young children sleeping in hotel rooms or holiday apartments began reconsidering every decision they had ever made. The demand for baby monitoring devices and childcare services at resorts rose sharply, and the phrase, "This could happen to anyone," became a reminder repeated everywhere. The image of Madeleine McCann, with her bright eyes and the small, distinctive mark on her iris, turned into a symbol warning that safety, something often taken for granted, can disappear in a single moment. That reality showed that convenience or privilege is not an absolute shield against serious incidents. The impact of the case extended far beyond parenting, influencing both law enforcement systems and public policy. In the years that followed, the European Union strengthened cross-border cooperation in missing child investigations. Interpol expanded its databases, and alert systems similar to Amber Alerts were adopted in several countries. Even reforms in evidence handling procedures and international coordination reflected the shortcomings seen during the earliest stages of the investigation. The case pushed institutions to confront the fact that administrative systems do not always move fast enough to protect those most vulnerable. Yet the Madeleine McCann effect also left a darker imprint on social life. The phrase, "doing a McCann," became an indirect way to describe parents who left their children alone even for a short time. It served as both a cultural warning and a form of judgment, a mechanism that allowed others to distance themselves from the tragedy while keeping it alive in the collective imagination. What began as empathy gradually transformed into a persistent curiosity surrounding the case. Documentaries about real crime, internet forums, and tabloid media transformed Madeleine McCann into a symbol of collective responsibility. where her name was no longer mentioned as that of a child, but as a case study in endless analyses and debates. The intensity of public attention reflects a primal truth. We are drawn to mysteries that touch our own fragility. Mysteries that remind us that the feeling of safety is sometimes only a thin shell. After 16 years, the case has not faded from collective memory because it is not only about a disappearance, but about human powerlessness in the face of uncertainty. It embodies our deepest fears, an incident without an explanation, suspicions without an endpoint, and sorrow without a place to rest. In a world that constantly demands answers, Madeleine's absence remains an unfillable void. The case resists every attempt at closure, refusing to conform to the narrative structure the public wants. And for that reason, it continues to be revisited again and again as a desperate effort to impose order on an event that has none. What the case ultimately reveals is more philosophical than legal. When confronted with crisis, people do not always choose truth. They choose what allows them to keep living. The Tapas 7 held on to a story that felt coherent rather than precise because coherence made reality less brutal. Investigators prioritized procedure over transparency because transparency meant acknowledging failures. The public embraced theories because ambiguity was too difficult to accept. Each reaction, imperfect as it may be, reflects a deeply human instinct to seek stability in the midst of chaos. The tragedy of the case does not lie in someone deliberately hiding the truth, but in the fact that those involved could not face the empty reality of not knowing what happened. Picture the final scene. Apartment 5A now stands empty, cleaned and repainted long ago to welcome new tenants. The shutters are closed, the window reflects the late afternoon Algarve light. In that pane of glass, the only thing left is the faint reflection of memory, distorted by time and no longer verifiable. Forensic specialists once stood in this very room, searching for every physical trace. Now, the only remnants are those that exist in the collective imagination. The stillness inside the apartment feels like a symbol of everything that cannot be determined. And perhaps that is what the story of Madeleine McCann ultimately suggests. Not only an unsolved disappearance, but a persistent question about how humans respond when confronted with an event beyond comprehension. When responsibility, fear, and helplessness intertwine, the truth becomes too heavy to fully acknowledge. Silence, in this case, does not necessarily conceal wrongdoing. Sometimes it is simply the only way a group of people can continue after a shock. As the apartment fades into darkness, another question emerges behind all the myths, debates, and speculation. Perhaps the issue is not who spoke incorrectly, but why no one could speak with certainty. It is this ambiguity that has stretched the case across so many years. Because deep down, the public recognizes a part of its own human nature in it, fragile in memory, fearful of randomness, and always seeking meaning in things that have no clear pattern. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann may never have a final answer, but its impact lies in the reminder that not all silence is meant to conceal. Sometimes, it is merely a natural response to something too difficult to face. And within this entire mystery, the greatest question is not only what happened to the little girl, but what happened to all of us as we tried to interpret a truth that could never be grasped.